Welcome to Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. The most insidious monsters are inside our own minds. Tonight, we will be hearing my session with the dread fire drake Smaug from Lord of the Rings. And he says, I am fire, I am death, yet I am trapped in my own mind. Featuring the voice of Joshua Ingle.
My teeth are swords. My claws are spears. My wings are a hurricane.
You're very powerful. And yet, some part of you wants something from seeing me today.
Bilbo said you have this dog. Tikda, Tikva, Tiki, yeah. And you say shake and then he shakes your hand and you can give him a tiny piece of cheese.
Uh-huh.
I know that most of my patients actually come see me because of my therapy dog, Tikva. So we have to fast forward a little bit because it did take Smaug quite a while to warm up to the real reason that he was coming in to see me.
So obviously that's how I would defeat Drogon in battle.
Uh-huh, of course.
My thoughts pester me like dwarves with pickaxes tapping on my brain. Tap, tap, tap.
What kind of thoughts?
Never mind that. How do I make them stop?
Usually, the harder you try to stop a thought, the more your brain just hangs on. Secrecy and shame fuel obsessive fears. Bringing them into the light for us to observe non-judgmentally can be healing.
OCD thief.
Don't be shy. Step into the light.
So it's very hard and often takes a very long time before patients will share with you their OCD thoughts. Obsessive compulsive disorder is recurrent, intrusive thoughts that cause anxiety, obsessions. Now, a lot of times people with OCD feel like their thoughts are unique to OCD, that if you don't have OCD, you wouldn't have such thoughts, but it's actually normal to have irrational, intrusive thoughts. The thing is that with OCD, these thoughts are uniquely sticky. They are stuck. They're laden with intensely painful emotions. They feel real. They often conjure very visceral sensory images in the person's mind. And then the person does the compulsions, repetitive behaviors, which can also be mental actions that you don't even see because they're inside the person's mind doing them, meant to provide temporary relief. So the harder you tell your brain, oh no, I will never have that thought again, the stronger the brain holds on. You can't stop OCD thoughts, but you can stop OCD compulsions, which helps not feed the thoughts. It's like a vicious ring to rule them all. Fred Penzel has a great quote. Compulsions start out as a solution to the problem of having obsessions, but soon become the problem itself. So an obsessive fear, well, what if I left the stove on? And anxiety builds. Oh my God, there could be a fire. Okay, I better check one more time. All right, then I'll know for sure. But do I really know for sure? What if when I checked, I nudged the dial some? I better go check again. And around it goes.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you.
And I understand why Frodo would wish that the ring had never come to him, as patients often wish that they were not burdened with these diagnoses. But unfortunately, as I emphasize to my patients, we don't choose our diagnoses. Whether we have a particular illness or not is not an option. Our choice lies in whether we accept that diagnosis and face the treatment for it. A lot of times patients will say, I don't want to do therapy. I don't want to do medication. I think underneath that lies the implication, I don't want to have this wrong with me. I don't want to have OCD. Or I don't want to have a psychiatric disorder. So to emphasize that there is a choice in whether they do the treatment. That's where their autonomy can be found again. And denial and refusal of treatment does not, unfortunately, erase the disorder. Facing treatment for OCD takes incredible courage. I know there's a lot of busyness on this slide, so hang in there with me. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to respect the amount of discomfort we are asking our patients to endure when we are recommending treatment to them. I think about Frodo, who very well could have stayed in the Shire and let the whole world burn. And he would have temporary relief in the Shire, but long-term wouldn't work out. When someone does a compulsion, they get temporary relief, traded for long-term agony. Resisting compulsions, doing exposures to what they're avoiding, it guarantees discomfort for long-term freedom. How do we address shame? Shame thrives in the darkness of secrecy and solitude. It cannot survive the light of open acceptance and human connection. Brene Brown has a great quote that shame derives its power from being unspeakable. So I emphasize this a lot because shame drives disconnection. It keeps our patients from telling us what's really going on. It keeps our patients from seeking treatment. It keeps our patients from taking medication. It's one of the biggest barriers to treatment that exists. If we don't first connect to patients where they can experience authentically being known and accepted unconditionally, we're not going to get anywhere. It doesn't matter what kind of training we've done in ICBT or ACT or how many well-designed exposures we have. If we haven't first connected enough to reduce their shame, we're not going to get them anywhere. Some things we can do to help patients open to us and let them know that we can handle what they need to tell us. First of all, I tell them, I can handle whatever you need to tell me. Pause. Let the patient fill that statement with whatever they're ready to share. It's understandable that this is really hard to talk about. Your job as a patient is harder than mine as a psychiatrist, acknowledging how difficult this is. It also helps to have a cute dog, Tiki, nearby. A quote by David Puder from Psychiatry and Psychotherapy podcast. It is hard to feel shame and togetherness at the same time. Togetherness reduces shame. It is hard to feel lonely and connected at the same time. So if we are connecting the patient will feel less lonely and less shame in the here and now of the therapeutic moment.
I see a dwarf and I think.
Oh, so this is the next part. Sorry. This is the next part of Smaug's story where he starts to open up to us about what thoughts he's actually having.
I see a dwarf and I think, did I look at that dwarf in a sexual way? What if I'm sexually attracted to dwarves? I know I am attracted to dragons. But how do I know for sure? I get this vivid image pops into my mind. Why am I even having this thought? Is it because deep down I secretly am?
Oops.
I see a dwarf and I
Sorry.
think, did I look at that dwarf in a sexual way? What if I'm sexually attracted to dwarves? I know I am attracted to dragons. But how do I know for sure? I get this vivid image pops into my mind. Why am I even having this thought? Is it because deep down I secretly am? I eat every dwarf I see, but then, before I ate that last dwarf, perhaps I hesitated.
John!
No, how can I live not knowing for certain? I started reading all the Frodo and Sam Flash fanfiction I could find to test if I felt anything like they felt. I looked at, images in the adult section of the dwarf library to prove it to myself, once and for all. I began avoiding dwarves, anything that reminded me of dwarves. I didn't leave the mountain. I counted gold over and over to distract myself. But the fear began again, and my own mind chained me to the floor of this cavern, alone.
So you hear how it starts with a simple thought that someone knows not to be true. That's stuck and then takes on a life of its own. And his world becomes smaller and smaller, avoiding triggers, chained and imprisoned by the rules of OCD. This is how avoiding triggers is a trap. The longer someone and the faster we run away from the triggers of the OCD thoughts, which is the instinctive thing to do, the smaller their world becomes. So be like Sam. Sam is the best, isn't he? And we counsel our patients how to face the OCD fears head on. That is no small ask at all. To recognize the lies that OCD tells, which you will hear now in Smeagol's voice.
Just one more time, then you will know for sure. If you just analyze it long enough, you will figure it out. You should do it, just in case. If something bad happens, you'll never be able to forgive yourself. I can't live with this thought. I have to make it go away. If you don't check it one more time, you won't ever be able to relax. If you weren't a bad person, you wouldn't have these thoughts. Sneaky little OCD. Wicked, tricksy, false.
Sneaky little OCD, wicked, tricksy, false. OCD is a thief. It's hard to comprehend how much brain space is taken up thinking about OCD-related things. So in Smaug's brain, which looks rather like a primate brain instead of a reptilian brain, I know, he's thinking about his sexual orientation most of the time, analyzing it to try to find out for sure. Sexual orientation OCD focuses on that. Checking for groinal sensations, avoiding triggers. And there's this tiny space left for actual meaningful things that he wants to be thinking about.
Have nice manners for a thief and a liar.
That is how OCD is a thief and a liar. Even after getting diagnosed, which by the way, on average, people with OCD see 3 to 4 doctors and spend over 9 years seeking treatment before they receive their accurate OCD diagnosis. Studies have found that it can take an average of 17 years from the time of diagnosis before they start actually getting appropriate treatment. So there is a huge amount of grief about the time lost, relationships lost, friends and family who are impacted. You're going to hear someone from International OCD Foundation speak about some of their grief after their diagnosis when they were finally getting their life back.
With that being said, though,
Yes.
when the diagnosis comes and the right treatment comes, and for me, it was at 31, and you suddenly reach a place of maintenance and management with OCD, that's when it hits you. For me, that's when it hit me. That's when I was like, holy crap, where did the 31 years go? And while I still had, meaningful experiences during that time, it hit me all at once that like I didn't even get a shot at some of that stuff. And how do I digest that and cope with those feelings? And I mean, they started out with lots of anger and frustration, and part of the reason I started advocating, which is why like people shouldn't have to lose giant chunks of their life because of a disorder and diagnosis that's treatable. And then from there it went into like wishing I could go back to trying to catch up, with myself and meet myself where I should be, and catch up and all the things. So I think this is such an important conversation, because it is the thing that comes up, sort of when you reach a place of maintenance and management with OCD. You sort of see the ruins of your life behind you, and how do you honor that and make room for it and experience it and feel it, try not to judge it, and then recognize where you are in the moment and how to move forward.
Yeah. People should not have to lose huge chunks of their life to a disorder that is treatable. So please, direct screening is key. People are very unlikely to bring this up without a direct screening. Don't miss OCD in patients. Ask them. Do you have odd thoughts that get stuck and you can't let them go? Do you have rituals that don't make sense? Are there things you have to do over and over again to prevent something bad from happening? And the OCIR is a free basic OCD screener. Patients can fill it out in your waiting room without taking extra time in the appointment even. There it is right there, and I included a link in the presentation. There are more specific assessments, like for example, Smaug is taking the SORT assessment for sexual orientation obsessions. These assessments can also be therapeutic in a way, because the OCD feels so irrational and strange to the individual that it's hard for them to really understand that they're not alone, that other people are sitting there agonizing over what their sexual orientation is. But then if they get an assessment and they're like, oh, wow, all of these things, I have these things, other people have these things because this is an assessment and they're on here. Sexual orientation OCD includes intrusive doubts about one's sexual orientation and a compulsive attempt to gain absolute certainty about what one's sexual orientation is. So it includes an unrealistic expectation of certainty, often fear of harming their romantic partner, that somehow they're going to discover that they are not the orientation they thought they were, and their romantic partner's life will be ruined because of that, or fears of other people perceiving them as a different sexual orientation than they are. John Hirschfield, I love his writing on OCD, says, the more you try to prove something to yourself that you already believe is true, the more you doubt your experience. So Smaug is now going to tell us about other OCD symptoms that he has. Very often people don't have one type of OCD. They have different types within one.
I keep wondering if anything is real. What if I'm just a character some British guy made up? How would I know? Am I who I think I am? Are these even my real thoughts? What if I'm not real? What if all my gold isn't real? You, my doctor, you might not be real. I could just be talking to myself right now. I don't think Drogon worries about these things, but he doesn't talk either, so I question whether he is even self-aware. Draco from Dragonheart thinks about it, but then just lets it go, just like that. But I can't stop.
So again, the OCD thoughts themselves are not unique. Other people might question, gosh, how would I know if I might be living in a simulation? That's odd. Okay. Or, gosh, someday I'm going to be dead and everybody I know is going to be dead. Well, that's a tough thing to deal with. I'm going to move on. These thoughts for an OCD individual are emotionally powerful, sticky, they feel real, and they can't let them go. It is a never-ending compulsive pursuit of a definitive answer to existential questions and existential OCD. Even so other people can wonder about it and move on. And someone with existential OCD is really plagued by this. And you might say, okay, well, where are the compulsions here? Compulsions can be mental rituals, asking questions, analyzing one's existence, trying to solve or fix a problem. Fearcast Smaug is listening to the episode by Michael Greenberg on how to stop ruminating here. I highly recommend Fearcast for your patients. 3 steps. Don't fix or solve a problem. Don't try to stop the thought. And don't follow the thought. Imagine it's like really scary Nazguls flying by. And the thoughts are coming. Did I turn off the stove? What if I get sick? Did I run over someone? Could I be a pedophile? We don't chase them. We definitely don't try to stop them. We wait for them to pass over. That's how we stop ruminating. Cultivating the impartial observer, non-judgmentally observing our own thoughts. Dr. Greenberg says, you can't control whether something is in your awareness, but you can control whether you direct your attention toward it.
What?
You can't make the Nazgul leave your awareness.
Thank you.
But if you don't try to force it to leave and don't direct attention to it, eventually it will fly away on its own. I think someone needs to mute, by the way, FYI. John Hirschfield has a sharks in an aquarium analogy, which I like better than mine because the sharks are actually behind glass. So it further emphasizes that the thoughts cannot harm. They're still scary. You're looking at these scary sharks. If you don't do it again, you'll feel wrong forever. You might go to hell forever if you don't confess that. But what if your mom dies because you didn't move it just a little? And letting the shark swim by.
Thoughts are not threats, Mr. Frodo. Feelings are not facts.
As Sam says. Recognizing that thoughts are not threats and feelings are not facts, even though this feels 100% real to the OCD person. This is also a technique of externalizing the disorder. So I think of externalization as the difference between Gandalf being over there, the snow is in his beard, he's in a really bad storm, the snow is piling up, it's really hard to see, he can't find his way forward. He's completely fused with OCD thoughts. You are in them and they feel real. Cognitive diffusion from OCD thoughts, creating emotional distance between yourself and the thoughts, is like, oh, I see an OCD storm cloud over there. For those who like Pokemon, yes, I put some Pokemon in here too. Practice catching every OCD thought and then relabeling it instead of something to be afraid of as, oh, that's an OCD brain fart. What if I'm a pedophile? What if I suffocated my baby? So you're looking at this slide. You might be thinking, okay, Dr. Greeter, are you really putting a slide about fear of sexually abusing children, fear of murdering one's infant, and making a comparison to passing gas? And yes, I am. Because dark humor is one of our best defenses against OCD. We respect the intense pain that these patients are going through, and we have to utilize humor as a defense to neutralize the pain of these thoughts. I want to differentiate between making fun of OCD thoughts and making fun of OCD people, or making fun of the disorder OCD, which is all over the media. OCD is not funny. We can make fun of the OCD thoughts, but never the sufferers of OCD. Jeffrey Schwartz has these 4 steps in his book Brain Lock. So, like Charizard was doing, step 1, relabel. That's an OCD thought. Step 2, reattribute. That's a brain fart, not me. Refocus on constructive behaviors. For Dragon Smaug, this is going to burn a village for 15 minutes to try to resist doing his compulsion. Revalue. Okay, my OCD thoughts aren't so relevant now.
You cannot hide.
So telling OCD, I see you. You cannot hide. Remembering that no matter how terrifying a thought feels or how relevant it feels, it is still not relevant. Behaving as if the thought is irrelevant despite how important it feels in the moment is really key in treatment. That's why podcaster Kevin Foss says it's not a thought problem, it's a feeling problem, because the thoughts are so hard to dismiss because they feel real. Draco recommends provide the shortest, most meaningless response that communicates disengagement and irrelevance. His existential OCD brain tells him, one day you'll be dead, and it will be as if you never existed. So what is the real meaning of any of this that you're doing right now? And he responds, thanks for that thought, puny brain. Short response, communicating disengagement and irrelevance, which is different than analyzing the truth of the thought or trying to stop the thought. So, why Smaug will never develop harm OCD, which is the fear of harming others, because he doesn't worry about harming others. It's not relevant to him. OCD preys on whatever we most fear.
Really, I love all your other books, John, but I don't need that one.
He doesn't need the Overcoming Harm OCD book. A Liberated Mind by Stephen Hayes is one of his several books, and it provides a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy tools. He recommends giving your mind a name, like Mr. Mind or George. Apparently, George is the name that Stephen Hayes actually gave his mind. You can find more of his cognitive diffusion techniques on his website down there under tools.
I'm naming my OCD mind George R.R. Martin.
I think Smaug is feeling a little bit competitive with Game of Thrones. The newspaper headline game is another way to communicate irrelevance to yourself. So you pretend that your OCD thought became a very dramatic newspaper headline. Here's an example of a hobbit who has the just right OCD where he needs to arrange things, playing the newspaper headline game. Breaking news. While setting table for second breakfast, local Shire resident places fork at a tilt, disrupting the mood of all partygoers with a dark, inescapable feeling of wrongness. All villagers lose appetite for a second breakfast, 11 C's, luncheon, supper, and dinner. An entire village starves. Games like these can be really helpful to our patients. We have to use humor when we're doing OCD treatment. So Smaug talks about his final victory over OCD.
When I finally began to free myself from OCD, I was angry. It stole so much time from me. But now I kill, not when OCD tells me I must, but when I want, where I want, and who I want. I am free. But facing OCD was my most grueling victory.
Yeah. To regain the freedom and autonomy. Exposure and response prevention is really a cornerstone of OCD treatment. There's in vivo exposures. So here, Smaug is giving a compliment to a dwarf. And he's reminding himself, I can have gay thoughts and not be gay. I can let go of certainty about my sexual orientation. I can tolerate the discomfort of this uncertainty while not engaging in my compulsion to murder the dwarf. Here he's doing some imaginal exposures, which is particularly good for existential OCD.
Is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
Says Morpheus. So, and he hears Neo saying, ever have that feeling you're not sure if you're awake or dreaming? The more we repeat a feared stimulus and the feared outcome does not happen, the less meaningful it becomes. You can't be bored and afraid at the same time. The habituation model of exposure and response prevention, which is in the past, aimed for gradual decline in anxiety, which was generally measured by subjective units of distress during exposures, to habituate to a feared stimulus. So the goal was to no longer have fear towards the stimulus. Postpartum harm OCD, very commonly, this is a type of OCD that appears during the postpartum period in which a new mom fears harming her newborn baby. A mother with postpartum OCD would be told to hold the baby close while she's having the thoughts, oh my God, what if I harm my baby? Until her fear of harming her baby subsides to a certain level. Now we're operating on an inhibitory learning model of exposure and response prevention. There's a great article, which I have at the top there, by Dr. Abramowitz and colleagues on inhibitory learning model of exposure and response prevention. The focus here is on anxiety tolerance, not habituation. To create experiences that support a new belief towards a stimulus that obsessional fears are less likely to happen. Obsessional thoughts can be tolerated. I can handle these thoughts. And that a compulsive ritual is not necessary to ensure safety or tolerate the anxiety. So for a woman with postpartum harm OCD, according to the inhibitory learning model of exposure and response prevention, the mother would be holding her baby, learning that the feared outcome of harming the baby that she expected to happen is less likely, and learning that she can tolerate the anxiety and the thoughts that appear while she holds her baby. Not expecting the anxiety to go away. It may subside as a natural consequence of doing this practice, but it isn't the primary goal. The primary goal is to gain confidence that the anxiety can be tolerated and the feared outcome is unlikely to happen. So in this model, we don't need to do more intense exposures beyond the level of what is actually being avoided. Dr. Greenberg calls this rumination-focused ERP, and I really like it. There are two main reasons to do an exposure. Do an exposure to eliminate avoidance. So for example, If you're avoiding touching a doorknob, touch it. You don't have to go the extra mile by licking your hand after touching the doorknob. Now that can be helpful. And traditionally when we were working under the habituation model, we would want to reach past what is being avoided to really sink in. And now we're thinking, it's not really necessary to go to all those lengths to learn and a new way of approaching these triggers that someone is avoiding. So do exposures to face the things that the patient is avoiding, and do exposures to confront a trigger for a compulsion in order to practice not doing a compulsion. So if public bathrooms generally trigger the compulsion of hand washing, we're going to have the patient practice entering the bathroom and not washing their hands, not doing the compulsion. And Dr. Abramowitz has a mnemonic for how we can set up exposures to maximize inhibitory learning. Always do something courageous and vulnerable.
A pithy mnemonic, Dr. Abramowitz.
Smaug approves. The A, standing for always, is anxiety tolerance. Emphasize tolerance of anxiety, not erasure of it. Then D, disconfirming expectations. When feared outcomes don't happen, an OCD trigger is linked to a new expectation, an expectation of safety. S, surprise. Inhibitory learning is most powerful when the outcome is surprising because there's a large mismatch between what was expected and what actually happened. So we can capitalize on the element of surprise by encouraging people to conduct exposures to feared situations that have a greater level of intensity than what the person believes would be safe or what they believe they can tolerate, to surprise them that they can't tolerate this. It helps to solidify learned safety in a way that best inhibits obsessional fear. And then combining fear cues. So combining multiple triggers at once in one exposure exercise. So for example, if someone has pedophilia OCD, meaning they fear the possibility of becoming a pedophile, their exposure might be holding their child on their lap, giving them a hug, and at the same time, imagining what it would be like if they were sexually touching their child, showing themselves that it's not going to happen. So combining different cues, the in vivo exposure and the imaginal exposure at the same time. And variety, frequently changing the context and style. So there's a greater chance that the learning will be generalized and they'll know they can tolerate any experience, thought, or feeling. The debrief after the exposure is, I think, even more valuable than how the exposure is designed in the first place. So now that you did this exposure, what was it like? How is it different than you feared it would be? Smaug is going to tell us about his exposure experience.
I thought that if I complimented that dwarf, it would plague me forever. I would never be able to let it go. I hated it, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It didn't really matter that much to me as time went on.
So he thought that it would plague him forever and he would never be comfortable again. And then he realized it really wasn't that bad. As time went on, it mattered less and less. Now, what if a feared outcome does occur after an exposure? Like you do get sick from not washing your hands. Okay, so Falkor the Luck Dragon, I'm going to read his story. My husband's voice needed to rest after he did all my Smaug slides, so he couldn't do my Falkor slide, unfortunately. Falkor, from the Neverending Story, he says, I was terrified that if I hit unlucky numbers, like the number 4, all my friends would suffer terrible luck, and my entire identity as a luck dragon would be lost. When I did my exposures and no bad luck came, that was helpful, sure. But you know what really freed me? The day I purposely did all my corkscrew dives in multiples of 4 and everyone had the worst luck. Atreyu stepped in horse dung, the childlike empress lost one of the pearls from her headpiece, tripping in front of the whole court, and I ran into a window from the upper tower, shattering it. Everyone just laughed and said, "Guess even luck dragons have bad days." So if a feared outcome does occur after an exposure, the confidence that can be gained knowing that you can handle the feared outcome if it does occur is really immensely valuable. So if a patient doesn't wash their hands, they get sick with the cold, they get better, they're like, I can handle being sick. I can really handle this. Identifying a patient's core fear. So this is the primary fear that all compulsions and avoidance are aimed at preventing. Usually it's some form of eternal emotional suffering that is feared most. It matters because identifying the core fear can make exposure therapy more precise and targeted, effective, and faster. And it shows patients that these seemingly nonsensical compulsions are strategies that they're using to protect themselves and their loved ones. Michael Greenberg says OCD treatment is about choosing to take risks. You can't choose to take a risk if you don't know what the risk is that you're taking. So we ask a patient, I always, like, what is the compulsion? Okay, so for Smaug, I kill every dwarf I meet immediately. What are you afraid might happen otherwise? I would be weak, disgusting lover of my enemy. What would be the worst possible consequence of this for you? I won't be able to defend myself. And how would this feel if this happened? Helpless. Also asking to fill in the blank, what does the patient avoid? I would never befriend a dwarf. What are you afraid would happen? I might be a sympathetic, emotional dwarf lover. And what would be the worst possible consequence of that? My enemy would control me. And how would you feel? Powerless. So Smaug's core fear underneath the sexual orientation OCD is
feeling powerless forever.
Feeling powerless forever. Common core OCD fears. Fear of being a bad person. So someone with postpartum harm OCD might fear being a neglectful mother. Fear of suffering forever. Fear of irreversibly ruining one's life. Fear of being alone forever. Fear of dying or causing a loved one to die. And you can go to Michael Greenberg's website to download that free worksheet to use with your patients to help with identifying core fears. Now, compulsions can actually masquerade as exposure exercises.
Sneaky little compulsions.
Very sneaky. How do we distinguish this? Here's an example. A healthy exposure. Smaug confronts a trigger. He compliments a dwarf. And Smaug non-judgmentally tolerates the OCD thoughts that come to mind while he's talking to the dwarf. He resists engaging in his compulsion to murder the dwarf to stop the OCD thoughts. Whereas a compulsion masquerading as an exposure, here it is. Smaug looks at pornographic dwarf images, monitors his groinal sensations to prove that he is not attracted to dwarves. So he's trying to prove something. That's a red flag. Any OCD thoughts that come to mind, he tries to find new ways to prove them false, to reassure himself that he is not attracted to dwarves. So what patients think they're doing as an exposure can actually be a sneaky compulsion. Now, what about distraction? Good or bad? It can be either one. A helpful distraction, directing attention to things more important to you without trying to suppress the OCD thought. So here's an example for Smaug. These thoughts come and go. I don't have to focus on them. I don't have to solve them. I can go reorganize my treasure hoard like I originally planned for the afternoon. Unhelpful distraction, also called thought suppression, trying to force the thoughts out of awareness. So that looks like I need these thoughts to go away. So I will keep pushing them out and thinking about my treasure. I will keep thinking of my treasure. I will keep organizing my hoard. I can't stop organizing my treasure, or the thoughts might come back. I'm going to cover ICBT now. I'm a big fan of ICBT, by the way. You can go to that link to get the free ICBT workbook. And it's pretty easy to learn, honestly, in the clinician's handbook for obsessive compulsive disorder. People can email me if they want a bunch of ICBT worksheets too, by the way. So it's really a kind of starting upstream instead of downstream, where I'm gonna move forward. Here we go. All right, sorry. I'm gonna go back. I decided to go out of order here. What do I mean by that? So there's a trigger, and the ICBT target is identifying the obsessional doubt. Whereas exposure and response targets these downstream, knowing you can tolerate the anxiety and resisting the compulsions. Okay, I'm going back now. So what is an obsessive doubt? It is a fear that is not based on sense data from the here and now, versus a rational doubt, fear based on direct evidence in the here and now. So it's about demonstrating to patients when a doubt is an obsessive doubt versus a rational doubt. When patients confuse an obsessive doubt and think that is relevant in the here and now, this is called inferential confusion, a distrust of your senses and common sense, and overvaluation of imagined possibilities that fuels obsessive doubts. Obsessive fear reasoning. If I don't wash my hands again, I could get sick and everyone else sick too. It uses reasoning like abstract facts. Well, germs do exist. General rules. People should stay clean. Hearsay. I saw someone on National Geographic get hepatitis that way. Personal experience from the past, not the here and now. I once got diarrhea after sharing a bathroom with my roommate who had diarrhea, probably from the doorknob. And possibility. Germs are all over. There is always a possibility of fatal illness. But are your hands unclean in the here and now? Rational fear. I see in the here and now your finger is amputated. You really should disinfect that photo. That is based on here and now sense data. So there's this moment where the brain passes from the here and now into a dissociative vortex of feared imagined possibilities that they call the OCD bubble. I imagine this kind of like, Smeagol. Smeagol's the OCD here, and he's like, you got to get in, go, master must go inside the tunnel. And here's his response.
Master must go inside the tunnel.
I don't think I want to go beyond my senses into the OCD bubble of imagined feared possibilities.
Good for you, Frodo. You do not want to go beyond your senses into the OCD bubble of imagined fear possibilities. Okay. So, we pick a OCD fear that the patient doesn't have that might seem kind of strange to them. For Smaug, for example,
fear of harming people by accident. Who would ever worry about that?
So we're going to give Smaug an example of harm OCD and show him the sequence of how it goes from the trigger, news story about someone hurting their children, obsessional doubt. Could I be one of those parents who harms their children? then into the OCD bubble of imagined consequences. If I am, then I am a danger to my children. I couldn't live knowing that I hurt my children. I better hide all of the knives at home, the compulsion. And then have the patient map out their own trigger, obsessional doubt, imagined consequence, anxiety, and compulsion to make it clear. There's the feared self, who I am and who I fear I could be. So for Smaug, his feared self is someone who is helpless, powerless, vulnerable to the enemy. Common OCD feared selves, an evil person, a wasteful person, a negligent person, someone who harms people. We help patients in ICBT connect and restore their confidence in their real self. Smaug is going to describe his restored confidence in his real self after we ask him, what does common sense tell him are his true goals and values? What does his actions suggest about the kind of person he is? And so you can even start a record. I took this from Cassandra Layton's website where she has, Layton, maybe is how you pronounce her name. She has a free ICBT workbook that you can download online. Actions I took today, qualities of the type of people who do those things.
It is impossible to be 100% sure about anything, but I can trust my common sense to tell me that I am a predator who rains terror on all who pass. I am not fraternizing with dwarves or the like. I am fire. I am death. Also, I am the wealthiest and most powerful being in all of Middle-earth.
Good for you, Smaug. Reconnecting with his real self. So, I really like this book for young kids, What to Do When Your Brain Gets Stuck, A Kid's Guide to Overcoming OCD. And a lot of self-compassion work can help in OCD too. I'm going to briefly touch on neurodiversity affirming OCD treatment. Jeremy Schumann has an amazing presentation that you can access on YouTube that covers this in great depth, and I cannot do it justice here. So I direct anyone there and encourage it. Free presentation. Traditionally, in cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, unfortunately, there has been a lot of harm caused because there's not, without there being enough respect for the choices, autonomy, and needs of autistic people. So we want to make sure that when we're doing behavioral therapy, that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We want to throw out anything that is coercive, like forcing someone to be exposed to their OCD fear. If we want to be aware that exposure therapy can inadvertently teach patients to hide their distress. So if we're not checking in with the patient about what's going on and having a really solid working alliance and emphasizing their autonomy, a patient can pretend that they're not in distress and learn to hide that distress to avoid the exposures. And so on the surface, we're going to say, oh, they're a success in treatment because they're not engaging in these compulsions so much, but inwardly, inside, they're still in just as much distress. Okay, any attempt to change identity or traits to appear more neurotypical can be thrown out of behavioral therapy. Treating special interests or stimming like an obsession or compulsion, that's actually a need of a neurodivergent individual for self-regulation, we can throw out, but we can keep exposure therapy because it is effective for OCD treatment in autism. Collaborative agenda setting, be values-based, practice acceptance and compassion. When we're doing a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy with an autistic individual, we may need to work on building emotional awareness and embodiment through practicing check-ins, practicing like creating a dialogue to talk about emotions, and developing the interoceptive awareness, which refers to one's perception of inner feeling states, to be able to do that emotional cognitive work. Focus on flexibility, creativity, and special interests are key here. Treatment should always be an invitation, not a command. Celebrating neurological difference, respecting self-agency and autonomy, valuing lived experience, exploring the function of a behavior instead of just trying to extinguish it, and free from guardrailing. To that end, I am going to do a deeper dive into differential diagnosis of OCD. Because if we are treating, if we don't have an accurate and detailed specific differential diagnosis, we will cause harm by administering the wrong treatment. Here's an example. This is a real TV show, OCD. Yeah, no, that's obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not OCD. Confusion, okay? Obsessive compulsive personality disorder versus obsessive compulsive disorder, and they can co-occur. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder, a chronic maladaptive pattern of excessive perfectionism, a preoccupation with orderliness and detail, a need for control over one's environment, and intense rigidity. It's often associated with excessive delayed gratification. So these are the patients who buy a new dress and it sits in my closet because I'm waiting for the perfect time to wear the dress. It's not time yet, right? Excessive delayed gratification, right? Because you think, oh, delayed gratification is a good thing, right? But it's not if you cannot enjoy life. So this is to the point where it's causing relationship stress. They're very, very vulnerable to burnout because of the perfectionism and the delayed gratification. Intensely self-critical. The behaviors are egocentric. That basically is a fancy way of saying the patient finds them to be in sync with their own identity, and they may actually take pride in the behaviors, the perfectionism, the orderliness. So this is different than OCD, preoccupation with intrusive fears, attempts to neutralize these fears, and it is ego dystonic. People want it to go away. They're generally ashamed and hiding the OCD. Treating these two together, OCPD and OCD, you might need to work on willingness and flexibility and do a lot of like acceptance and commitment therapy, values-based stuff to get more buy-in prior to going into the exposure therapy. There's a great podcast episode of the OCD stories by Dr. Anthony Pinto on OCPD, which I highly recommend.
Base diagnosis on patient's internal experience, not just their external behavior.
Thank you. Thank you, Smaug. Yes. Base your diagnosis on a patient's internal experience, not just external behavior. So we're going to go into the differential diagnosis for repetitive behaviors. As Smaug says, simply having the most impressive hoard in all of Middle-earth does not make me a hoarder. So a collecting dragon. He says, I love showing off my elven artifacts to my friend Drogon. I like to carefully plan out how I can trade certain things out for new things to enhance my collection. Hurry inside. I want to show you my new collection of mithril armor. That is a collecting dragon. You can see that there's pride. He's enjoying it as part of his identity. A hoarding dragon. Don't come inside. I'm really sick. So at first, I feel a rush of excitement when I find a new elven artifact. I can't leave it. I have to bring it back, but I have no space for it. Drogon tries to come over, but I make excuses why he can't come inside. I'm too ashamed. Bilbo urged me to donate things, but the thought of losing a single piece forever just overwhelms me with grief. What if I regret it later? You see in that the shame and there's an addictive quality to it. There's like a dopamine rush when you collect a new, pick up a new thing and bring it back. And then the despair, the complete overwhelming grief when a hoarding person thinks about letting go of an object. What if I regret it later? And then OCPD dragon, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. It says dragons who throw all their gold in one heap don't have treasure, they have trash. These same trash lizards fly over towns, leaving 70% of the townsfolk still alive. I organize my treasure first by civilization of origin, then date, then utility of object. There is no town I have not demolished in its entirety. If you pillage a village and there is a structure standing higher than 3 feet when you are done, you should be ashamed. That is gross negligence. And you see there's relationship stress here between Maleficent and Smaug because of his OCPD. Commonly, an OCPD patient is going to come in and be like, I don't know why I'm here. My spouse said I had to come in. But they really are internally suffering a lot. The burnout, the self-criticism, the drain on the people who are around them. OCPD. Then the OCD dragon. I see that Arkenstone. Dread comes over me. If I don't have it facing just right, something terrible will happen. Maybe Drogon will die. Then I have to fix the other gems. If I touch one side, I must touch the other side. The same way, if I don't, I might be stuck with this not right feeling forever. That's the core fear there. The feeling pain forever. So the individual wants to stop, but they are afraid. OCD. Now, autistic dragon. So, autistic dragon is talking about his treasure. When the outside world overwhelms me, I can escape to my treasure pile, research my artifacts, and find new ways to reorganize them. This helps me recharge. When I have to go out and talk with other dragons, it can be really a drain unless someone wants to talk about ancient elven artifacts. Then it's like, where did the time go? So with this dragon, the repetitive organizing and researching of the treasure is a stim. Stims are not something we want to treat, unlike OCD, because the stimming provides emotional regulation. It is enjoyable for the individual. This is where the internal experience of the individual is very important to identify. And then the special interest. The autistic dragon loves learning about, talking about ancient elven artifacts. This should be encouraged. Tourette's dragon. An urge builds in my talons. I can resist for a while, but then I just have to scrape my talon across the gold. I feel relief for a while, but the urge comes back. If someone's looking at me or I'm stressed, it's even worse. I can hold it back for a while, but eventually it just comes out worse. It's the same feeling I get when I have to blink my eyes or clear my throat. So this is a tic. And Tourette's and OCD and ADHD too often co-occur. Their treatment is different. It's important to distinguish them because we are going to be treating them differently. They cause chaos between the orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and caudate nucleus. So, stimming. Self-soothing repetitive movements that provide emotionally regulating sensory input. They tend to be prolonged, and they're usually present from a very young age. Tics. They're usually a brief, sporadic repetitive motor movement, or vocalization. And there's an urge that builds, the premonitory urge, until the tic is completed. And they can be voluntarily suppressed for a while. Average age of onset for tics is 7 years. So they're presenting a little later too. An OCD compulsion, driven by the need to reduce fear temporarily. So the urge to act on them tends to dissipate, to decrease the longer someone resists the compulsion. People wish they could stop. For stimming, we collaborate with each individual and help them do more of what is regulating for their body. If a stim is causing harm, like if it's like picking, and I'm talking about a stim, I'm not talking about skin picking disorder, which is something separate, or like head banging against a wall is causing harm, for example. We're going to be collaborating with that individual to help pick an alternative way of getting their body the sensory input it needs. We're going to help this individual decide when they want to mask or suppress the stim, like if they're being pulled over by police, and help them intentionally find more environments in which it's safe to unmask and do their stimming. For tics, we have habit reversal training, CBIT, psychoeducation, because most tics are benign and you just leave them alone. And guanfacine, clonidine, our first line, the alpha adrenergic agonist, second line being aripiprazole and risperidone. Farther down the treatment algorithm, Topamax and memantine are possible, versus compulsions, which we're going to go into more depth about medication options for OCD, but we're treating those with SSRIs, clomipramine, exposure and response therapy, ICBT, etc. Okay. So it's important to distinguish the differential diagnosis and spend time on it, or we can't provide treatment that is helpful and we will cause harm. All right. Now, BFRBs, skin picking and hair pulling. Do not treat them like OCD, please. Okay. Treatment is actually more similar to that of an addictive disorder than an anxiety disorder. I see people all the time are like, oh, they have skin picking, and trying to do OCD type therapy or do an SSRI for this. Treatment strategies for this are habit reversal training and glutamatergic strategies. We're talking N-acetylcysteine, Riluzole, naltrexone, which you might notice is also used for to reduce alcohol cravings. And whereas we're going to be encouraging someone with OCD to be facing their triggers, for someone who is skin picking, we're going to be reducing triggers, like giving them Vaseline to smooth out their scalp if a certain because often a felt sense of unevenness will trigger picking, or having them wear gloves, having them have a fidget on hand. Some patients will describe a strong urge that builds over time to pull their hair out or pick a specific area that they're really trying to resist. Other patients, it's almost like they go into a dissociative state and they're already picking and pulling and they didn't even realize how they got there. Oh, by the way, bfrb.org, the TLC Foundation for Body Focused Repetitive Behaviors, has so many great resources on it. I could do another whole presentation just about BFRB treatment, but I'm leaving it at that. So find out, how does the patient feel about the behavior? What function does the behavior serve? What feelings are driving the behavior? Are they avoiding a certain feeling? Are they seeking a certain feeling? Base diagnosis on internal experience, not just external behavior. I'm going to go into hoarding in more detail in treatment. I think it's very, there's not, unfortunately, I really wish there was more information on treatment of hoarding disorder. It was previously considered a subtype of OCD, but it's now recognized as its own distinct and separate disorder. About 20% of people with hoarding disorder also have OCD. But most hoarders actually don't have OCD. So there's an experience of intense joy, a big dopamine hit when acquiring a new item, kind of an addictive quality to it, and an experience of intense fear when faced with discarding items. It may be related to sentimental value. They place sentimental value on items that other people don't place sentimental value on. Fear of forgetting memories associated with an item. So there can be an overlap between dementia and hoarding. They may anthropomorphize items. They may fear hurting an item's feelings if they get rid of it, or have strong beliefs about items holding value that others just cannot see. So there's evidence that hoarding is related to impairments in attention and impulse control, and there's actually a lot of overlap with ADHD. Hoarders form stronger and faster attachments to objects than non-hoarders, based on studies. They are also more likely to have an anxious attachment style. They may be attaching to objects due to unmet human attachment needs, and are more likely to have experienced interpersonal trauma. Women are more commonly anthropomorphizing objects, like not wanting to hurt an object's feelings or having sentimental value towards objects. And men are more commonly not wanting to avoid waste in hoarding objects. So we talk about how Frodo became a hoarder. While spring cleaning, local Shire resident donates old ring believed to be worthless trinket, later to discover that he is doomed Middle-earth to total annihilation by evil lord. Regrets decision forever, crushed under the weight of his own guilt. And it's this very intense story. That part can be similar to OCD, this intense story that someone can have in their mind about an object that is beyond the here and now and into the realm of imagination. Now we're going to go over medication treatment finally. And then I'll take questions shortly after that. Start SSRIs, first line treatment for OCD, at tiny hobbit dosages, but titrate them to dragon dosages for OCD. So what do I mean? I mean, start small, because people with OCD and anxiety are more likely to have side effects, to get activated and have an increase in anxiety when starting SSRIs. Here's some example of some Mushu size starting doses of SSRIs. Then medium doses for toothless here of fluoxetine, sertraline, fluvoxamine, and escitalopram. And these are usually your like end point for major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. Not for OCD though. The Smaug doses for OCD. Fluoxetine up to 120 milligrams. Sertraline up to, these are maxes, 400 milligrams. Fluvoxamine up to 450 milligrams. Escitalopram up to 40. So with partial response and tolerable side effects, keep going up, because there are people who don't respond at 200 milligrams of sertraline who will at 300 milligrams to 400. This is Psychopharmacology Institute, and there's a little table that I copied from them. I find them to be a really great resource in staying up to date on psychopharmacology. And also, even if you're a therapist and you want to learn more about medications, I still recommend them. Smaug is doing his research. And these are some of the articles that were my favorites that I read when I was going over these treatment algorithms. Now, I need to mention though, these treatment algorithms, they don't agree with each other. And that's psychiatry at large. When I do these presentations, I am presenting one evidence-based way of treating these things, but that is not the only way. And I just want to point that out there. There is not agreement. Augmentation strategies. So you got your SSRI going, you went pretty high on the dose, and it's not doing enough. My favorite augmentation strategy is the combo of fluvoxamine and clomipramine. Fluvoxamine says, you augment me perfectly. Clomipramine says, I know. I'm also okay just on my own, though. And clomipramine, I personally rarely use it as monotherapy because of the higher side effect profile. As a tricyclic, it can, cause sedation, weight gain, constipation. So I'm usually using it to augment my SSRI, starting at 25 milligrams, maxing it at 250 milligrams. And I love that you can check a blood level and that we have a target blood level of 250 to 400. You don't really want to go above 400 ideally, and then cardiac toxicity happens at higher levels. So it's kind of a pain because you got to get an EKG when you're using this medicine. There's also some evidence that it doesn't work as well combined with Prozac, Celexa, and Paxil, combined with SSRIs that aren't fluvoxamine. Fluvoxamine and clomipramine are particularly great in combination because fluvoxamine inhibits cytochrome 1A2, the main enzyme metabolizing clomipramine. And then there's more clomipramine present and less of the active metabolite, desmethylclomipramine. You can actually, there's evidence that the higher the ratio of clomipramine to desmethylclomipramine, the better the treatment response. So you want more of that clomipramine present. So the fluvoxamine is making your clomipramine more effective here, which is really nice. The clomipramine is acting more on serotonin, and its metabolite desmethylclomipramine is acting more on norepinephrine. But when you are inhibiting something's metabolism, you're going to end up with a higher blood level than you anticipated. So you check an EKG and you check a blood level before going higher than 75 milligrams on this one. Then other augmentation strategies. Risperidone and aripiprazole have, next to clomipramine, the largest evidence in support of their use as an augmenter to your SSRI. You can consider olanzapine and quetiapine. Risperidone at 1 to 3 milligrams, aripiprazole 5 to 15 milligrams. I would really have a low threshold for starting metformin to decrease weight gain when starting these meds and decrease metabolic risks. Monitor the A1C for onset of diabetes and the lipids. It's pretty benign to start metformin. You do want to check glomerular filtration rate to make sure that's high enough so that there's no kidney dysfunction, so that you're not at risk for lactic acidosis before starting the metformin. But and periodically check a B12 because metformin can interfere with absorption of B12. But other than that, go for it. So much better to start metformin and prevent weight gain than be trying to deal with it later with your patient having diabetes. All right, other augmentation, and acetylcysteine. Some patients, they're going to love the autonomy of being able to buy something over the counter and that it's a natural supplement and that's going to feel good to them. And why the heck not? It's pretty benign. Okay. There are stronger glutamatergic strategies available to us than N-acetylcysteine. Okay, so it's acting through glutamate. I will tell you, this medicine is a lot more effective for skin picking and hair pulling in those BFRBs than it is for OCD. It's worth a shot. And again, this is an augmentation strategy. It is not going to do stuff by itself. Some stronger glutamatergic augmentation strategies, memantine. Memantine actually has some great data behind it. And riluzole, you do have to monitor liver functions while on riluzole. Coming down the pipeline, D-cycloserine is being investigated. There's some evidence that giving D-cycloserine right before doing an exposure exercise can accelerate inhibitory learning. So that's kind of cool, priming your brain. Very interesting. So some of the, no, some of the algorithms were starting with memantine as the preferred augmentation strategy instead of clomipramine or the atypical antipsychotics. And some are more pro-clomipramine and atypical antipsychotics first. The stickler here was there's more evidence to support the effectiveness of clomipramine and the atypical antipsychotics as augmentation strategies. However, memantine has a very benign side effect profile. You're not going to have to get your EKG and check your blood levels. And then it's not going to cause weight gain like your antipsychotics. So that was kind of the controversy there of like, what is your next go-to thing? Farther down the treatment algorithm. Farther down. But worth a shot. Buspirone, ondansetron, inositol, lamotrigine, which interestingly, lamotrigine can actually trigger new onset OCD, but it also can treat OCD. Psychiatry is complicated. Antibiotics are being explored, and topiramate. What about stimulants? Yeah. So I see people avoiding a trial of stimulants in kids with OCD and tics because they're afraid of making the OCD worse or they're afraid of making the tics worse. That is valid, but it shouldn't keep someone from a trial of a first-line medication. So there are some patients for whom it is true that stimulants are going to worsen their tics or worsen their OCD. However, there's a large number of patients for whom stimulants are actually going to improve tics and improve OCD. So you don't know until you try it. And you don't want to keep a first line treatment from your patient with ADHD. And interestingly, I see a lot of patients who have ADHD whose OCD does not respond to treatment until the ADHD is treated with a stimulant. Here's a study. These are patients who don't have ADHD, where there's evidence that stimulants will treat treatment refractory OCD. So this is fluvoxamine plus extended release methylphenidate, improving treatment refractory OCD. So stimulants, yeah, it could go bad, but they're definitely worth a try and they could actually really help. Okay. Cannabis and OCD. Yeah, it's not good. Patients can experience a short-term, really dramatic reduction in OCD symptoms on cannabis. But unfortunately, the data shows that they quickly develop a tolerance to this effect, needing to use more and more cannabis. And then in an 18-month follow-up study that had an increased intensity of their OCD symptoms than they started the study with. And then when they abstained from cannabis, the symptoms went back to baseline and improved. So I think it's important to counsel patients that the immediate effect they feel while under the influence of a particular substance, alcohol, cannabis, in the short term, reducing anxiety, does not equate to a long-term benefit. In fact, it does equate to long-term harm when it comes to cannabis. And yes, I have a very rather naughty photo of Smeagol over here. with his blunt, and that's because honestly, cannabis isn't a bad thing. It has great medical uses. I try to emphasize that with patients. Like, yeah, I'm not anti-cannabis. I believe that it is very helpful with chronic pain. It's extremely helpful for some seizure patients. It just doesn't help for psychiatry, unfortunately. And it can feel like trying to get your patient away from their cannabis will be about as successful as trying to get Smeagol away from the ring. It can be hard. It can be hard, but here's some data. Here's some research. What about bipolar disorder and OCD, guys?
Bipolar disorder and OCD. Very tricksy.
Very tricksy. Yes. Okay, so before you start your SSRI for OCD, please screen for a history of a manic episode, because if your patient has bipolar disorder, you can worsen mood destabilization and precipitate a manic switch. It's really controversial whether you can add on an SSRI to someone with OCD with bipolar once they have a therapeutic level of a mood stabilizer on board. There's evidence that it can be harmful and destabilize their bipolar symptoms, causing them more switches between depression and mania. In particular, you want to avoid clomipramine and all the tricyclic type antidepressants because they have a higher rate of precipitating a manic switch than SSRIs. Some options here that are safer. Memantine. Oh, look, there's a study. Memantine is an adjuvant treatment for OCD in the manic phase of bipolar disorder, that it didn't make the mania worse, at least. Lamotrigine, aripiprazole, topiramate are some options. This is a tricky situation, though, not going to lie. Deep brain TMS. That could be an option for these patients, too. So I want to emphasize that the TMS they're using to treat OCD is different than regular TMS. It's targeting deeper brain structures, the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. So it's a totally different H7 TMS coil. I point this out because if your patient has had TMS, but no one knew they had OCD and they had regular TMS, they can't we can't extrapolate that TMS doesn't work for them because they haven't had the type of TMS that targets OCD, deep brain TMS, targeting the corticostriatal thalamic cortical loop. That's the ring. So hypothesized hyperactivity of this orbital frontal cortex, that's that front part there, that's the blue part, to the anterior cingulate cortex and striatum down here is our hypothesized neurobiology of OCD. Again, Smaug has a very human-looking brain, but he's a very intelligent being here, okay? So he doesn't have a lizard brain. Pandas. Pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infection. So, why is this so controversial? It's controversial because, unfortunately, some patients are preyed upon using non-evidence-based treatments and being diagnosed with pandas when they don't have pandas, which kind of caused a backlash on many doctors to say that pandas didn't exist. That's not true. Pandas is real. It does exist. It is very specific. It's not many people really understand what pandas is. Furthermore, the test for the antibodies that can cause pandas, antibodies to streptolysin O and DNase B, they remain elevated for several months after a particular strep infection. And having these antibodies is very common. Simply having antibodies to streptolysin O and DNase B does not mean that you have pandas. It does mean that you've had strep. So what is pandas? Pandas is an autoimmune syndrome. Antibodies to strep attack the nervous system. Specifically, they found these antibodies in children with pandas that bind in both the children's brains and in a mouse brain to these cholinergic interneurons, a particular type of neuron in the brain. Okay, and they are part of the corticostriatal thalamocortical circuit of OCD. These antibodies will also decrease in concentration after successful treatment for pandas. So it's not the strep infection itself. It's not like a toxin from the strep virus. It is your immune system's antibodies to the strep virus that are then attacking neurons in the brain. This is acute, very dramatic onset of symptoms. Like symptoms are surging within a week when a child has pandas. It is common in young children. So this is usually like around age 3. The rapid onset of OCD symptoms is a key part of the diagnosis of pandas. Very rapid, dramatic onset. And it doesn't just include OCD symptoms. In these children, there's severe behavioral regression. So the child was toileting on the potty and now they're wetting the bed. It also very commonly includes food restriction, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, refusal to eat, tics, severe aggression, and motor abnormalities. So severe clumsiness, worsening handwriting, severe hyperactivity, very distant from one's baseline. Treatment includes usually a short-term antibiotics for infection, like 3 to 4 weeks. And it's somewhat confusing because we're using antibiotics, even though the strep bacterial may be gone. And there's some evidence that the antibiotics themselves are playing an anti-inflammatory role, not just an antibacterial role. We're also doing other anti-inflammatory treatments, steroids and NSAIDs. Naproxen is most commonly used, dosed twice a day. So be aware of what PANDAS is. Part of the controversy, I believe, comes from parents wanting to believe, understandably, that there is a quick fix of antibiotics and naproxen for their child's illness, or wanting an illness that feels more neurological than psychological, even though OCD is just as neurological, based in the brain, as PANDAS is. But due to stigma and misunderstanding of psychiatric disorders, it's somehow more palatable to people to have a autoimmune disorder than a psychiatric disorder. Include family members and educate family members if you want treatment to be successful. Bodo wouldn't have got far without Sam. So when you're including family members, emphasize externalizing the disorder. So instead of the family, the parent fighting with the child about the compulsion, upset with the child, identify the compulsion as the problem, not the person. Help family members understand that the OCD behaviors they see represent a tiny fraction of the OCD noise going on inside their loved ones' heads. It's really helpful if a family member can demonstrate their own willingness to be uncomfortable for their family member. Their willingness to maybe not wash their hands in solidarity. Their willingness to go to therapy themselves to find out how they can have themselves in the best place to be supportive. to understand the painful irony that though a loved one is really um, the behaviors they're doing, the trapped um, place that they're in, is really painful for the loved one. And ironically, that may represent their loved one with OCD's best attempt to protect that person. Like if they have harm OCD, um, the mother who is so terrified of harming her infant because she loves her infant so much that she won't hold her infant ultimately is harming her infant by not having that maternal attachment happening. Um, and so on the spouse will see the mom not holding the infant and experience that simply as something painful. So help the family member understand that this is the OCD person's best attempt to protect themselves and their loved ones, even though it's not working. Yeah. John Hirschfield says, you see how things are, but your family member sees how they could be. In coaching family members on the difference between reassurance, which we want to avoid, and healthy support, which we want to do. Reassurance looks like you don't have to check it again. I know the stove is off. I've answered that question for you, which is like a bit of a addictive drug because you reassure them. And what do they want? More reassurance. The OCD fear doesn't go away. And then asking for reassurance about a particular OCD fear is a very common compulsion. It can be very hard to get loved ones unstuck from this and take time. We don't want a loved one to just very dramatically and suddenly give up what they've been doing this time. We want them to be working with a therapist and included in sessions, very mindfully and intentionally letting go of reassurance over time. It also looks like, okay, I'll clean it for you so you can relax. I'm going to help, right? And this is instinctive and natural to do when a family member is suffering. We want it to go away. And it does temporarily help it go away. In the long run, you're stuck. John Hirschfield has a great book when a family member has OCD that I recommend to all my patients' families. Healthy support. That looks like, okay, I see you stressed out about the stove. The OCD is really loud for you right now. I'm here. I see you. I'm with you. I'm not trying to fix it for you. I'm not trying to protect you from it. I'm not trying to undo it. It's really hard for you not to wash right now. I don't know how you'll handle it, but I'm here for you when you're ready to try. It takes a lot of courage to show up that way. So coaching family members that, like Sam, you can't carry the ring for Frodo. You can support Frodo. Don't challenge the OCD fear. No, it's clean. Challenge the person. I know you can do this hard stuff. I know the OCD is really loud for you right now. Here's Sam.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you.
You can't carry the OCD for Frodo, but he can carry him. Isn't Sam like the best character of all time too? And it's hard to be present with a family member suffering so much. People have this idea in psychiatry that, oh, it's so hard, figuring out what medication to prescribe at what dosage, but that's not the hard part of psychiatry, in my opinion. What's really hard is authentically being present with immense emotional pain of the person in front of you, and knowing that you cannot do it for them, and you cannot make them do it, and you cannot take it away from them. I think that's the hard part. So I want to point out here as professionals too, the patient is the hero, not you. It is their journey. Reminding patients. One of the phrases I actually say most often is just simply, I'm with you, to my patients. So, thank you for hanging in there with me for so long for this very long presentation. Please screen all patients for OCD and engage them collaboratively in treatment. Connect first, collaborate second, and always stay curious. You can download slides from past presentations on my website. And if you're not on my list already, you can email me so that you can get invites to future presentations and video recordings. Special thank you to my husband, Joshua Engel, who is still resting his voice after doing all of my Smaug recordings and who supports my dreams here. Thank you. I'm going to stop my video recording and take questions. Okay. There you go. All right, I'm going to the chat. I'm going to stop my screen share. All right, hello. Questions, anyone? Hopefully you guys can hear me.
I have a question.
Hi, Kira. This is my awesome PA, Kira. Thank you.
Hi, of course. Thank you. This was great. How do you like measure the effectiveness or success of like a medication? Like sometimes when I will meet a patient, I'll say like, what percent of the day do you think OCD, the thoughts, which again is mostly in the compulsions, and we kind of put a number to it, a percent, and then kind of I ask them along the way, like, is that number going up? Is it going down? Is it staying about the same? Do you have any other like better way to measure effectiveness?
Yeah, I think, right, like where do we put the goalpost for what we consider successful treatment? Oh, my video is off? Oh, was my video off the whole time? I hope not. Oh, you know what? I think I stopped my video instead of stopping the recording.